this idea of resilience certainly is relevant, and having extra capacity and the ability to deal with that. Now, it's interesting to compare different countries and how they've been affected by the pandemic in terms of how they've been able to return to normal afterwards. Like you're describing in Toronto, they probably laid off a bunch of the workers there at the airport, and here in Norway they didn't lay them off. Here they have a means of a temporary layoff where you're not technically losing your job while you're not getting paid by your employer. But that means that you don't have to retrain them, you don't have to rehire them. It's a lot quicker. And looking at things like that, are interesting. Also, I think looking at what are sort of the alternative means of returning to normal. What are your options in terms of flexibility, bringing in new carriers, having all other ways of dealing with this. But that said, we've had a lot of the same issues here in Europe as you're describing, and this sort of behavioral issue. You say that for some reason, people are all wanting to travel. That should hardly come as a shock, but this ability to think in terms of scenarios and try to predict behavior and try to predict sort of how you have secondary and tertiary effects of events, that is important, but also difficult. I think it's interesting because a lot of big organizations had done risk assessments where pandemics were a scenario that they considered, but in many cases, they'd only looked at the primary effects of the pandemic. How will this affect our staff? How will it affect our sickness, absenteeism, that kind of thing? But they hadn't predicted the secondary and the tertiary effects. The airport disruptions, the supply chain disruptions, all those things. So yeah.
Well, welcome to the Safeopedia podcast. Now you're listening to Kristian Gould, and Kristian is the leading advisor of the human factors and organizational safety at Equinor. Did I pronounce that correctly?
Equinor, yeah, and I'm no longer a leading advisor. I'm just a specialist now, but I held that position for 6 years. So okay. That's a rotating role. Right.
So a specialist. So we'll get into that in a minute. Just to let our audience who are listening in know, Kristian will also be speaking at the EH&S Congress in Berlin. That's from September the 13th to the 14th. So if you haven't yet, check that out. So Kristian, I wanted to go back actually to what we were talking about. And I find what you're talking about very interesting about the risk assessment, and that people had done in their risk assessment a purview of, like, if there was a pandemic, how would that impact, right, the business? But you said that people looked at the primary, but not the secondary. And I think the word you used was tertiary.
You have all these knock-on effects, and you can consider, how will a pandemic affect the capacity at our hospitals? How will it affect our ability to distribute vaccines? Those kinds of things. But predicting how it'll affect people's behavior, how many people are getting into home improvement at the same time, how many people will be working online from home at the same time, and also, later on, people's desire to go on a holiday afterwards, all at the same time. Those are secondary and tertiary effects. So you can see that in a lot of cases. I think there's a good quote that says that, good science fiction doesn't predict the automobile, it predicts the traffic jam. And I think that is sort of what we're talking about here. It's easy to envision the primary effect, but what that means for other things can be a lot harder.
Okay, so let's walk through this a little bit, because I do think that there's ways to predict those secondary and tertiary impacts, right? I know that when we do our risk assessment for for something and say we're looking at a pandemic, you know, we want to look historically at what has happened before and then see, I would think that some research would help us kind of do some predictions. Am I correct on this or off base?
I think you're correct, and I think looking, you know, historically at how society and how organizations have responded to this can tell us a lot. And these things, they don't necessarily change that much over time. So looking at incidents and situations 100 years ago might be quite informative of the situation that we're in today. I always think that, you know, a good ability to predict risk is dependent on imagination, and our ability to imagine things that we've not seen before is incredibly important, but it's also incredibly dependent on how we facilitate risk assessments, our ability to sort of elicit people's knowledge, their experience, try to have people think in the abstract, have people combining their shared knowledge in terms of understanding and probably imagining things that they've never seen before. And you know, the coronavirus pandemic was a good example of that. So
yeah, and talking about looking at history, like if we look back actually in history, now I'm over here in Canada and I know that you're in Norway, so we're two different countries. I get that. So over here, I know, like when I researched when I was in retail, I noticed first off a trend. I'm in grocery retail, just to rephrase that, food and beverage, right? So I had noticed a trend in flu getting more aggressive over the years. Now, of course, I'd never thought of something like the coronavirus because that was science fiction, as we would say, right? Something like that would be in a TV movie. But what I did see over the years was more people coming to work with a common cold or flu-like symptoms. And so I did some research and I created a flu pandemic assessment. Right now, I'll be upfront with you. I didn't think about researching 100 years back and then learning about the nuances of the Spanish flu. Now, that was really incredible because when COVID hit and then people started talking about it and I started reading about it, I was like, wow, it's almost a mirror effect of what we're going through today. Even like, and I'm talking about the secondary and the tertiary, or like the behavioral factors of the division in the society, where there were people who wanted to wear masks and people who didn't, people who believed and people who didn't. Right. Yeah. And so what can you share with our audience to kind of get us thinking about where we should be looking for research? How do we prepare for different uncertainties? Like, what would your advice be as an expert in this area?
I think there's a lot to be learned from research on risk perception, how people they don't necessarily think about risk in terms of actual probabilities. They think about it in emotional terms, and a lot of that is sociological. It's based on how do people behave in groups, how do people behave as a society, and we, you know, we can see a lot of specific examples of that with the pandemic. Every country had this sort of moment of truth where people became aware of the seriousness of the coronavirus pandemic, and that moment was different from country to country. I'm sure it was different from Canada to Norway to, you know, everywhere else in the world.
And just Canada and the United States.
For sure.
I mean, right. You would think that because we are North American beside each other, maybe people were thinking, well, the two countries will see it again, the same.
Right.
It didn't happen.
You know, and yeah, right. And you know, and here in Norway, it was March 12th, 2020. And I remember I was traveling, you know, 2 weeks before then. And I was in that airport in Helsinki, Finland, where there were a lot of Asian travelers passing through. And I remember seeing most of them wearing face masks. And I was thinking, you know, what are these guys doing? You know, why are they so worried? And then guess what? You know, a year later, everyone here is wearing face masks. But at that time, it made no sense for me at all to be wearing a face mask. And a lot of that is about what were the cultural norms where I live, what was my peer group doing, what was expected from people around me, how to behave and that kind of thing. And that definitely affects people's behavior, and it definitely affects people's perception of risk. And I think that really is important, because how these norms become established is interesting to look at. And I'm sure that you could see differences in Canada between, you know, urban centers like Toronto and more rural areas in terms of people's perception of risk relating to the pandemic, but also in terms of how people responded through their behavior, to which degree they would, you know, wear a mask, to which degree they would socially distance, all these things. And I think an important lesson to learn from that is what is it that actually predicts people's behavior as a result of their perception of risk. And there's a ton of good research on that in many ways. Also in terms of looking at how are safety mitigating actions, you know, adhered to, how are they followed up, and there you can see, you know, a lot of good research also on safety culture, on the huge disparity that you can sometimes find between what people think, what they say, and what they actually do. So
yeah, I'd like to dive into that right there. What people say, what people think, say, and do. What has your learnings been about why there is such a disparity in that? Because that's something that I know my listeners for sure have brought up, and they'd like to understand that better. So
yeah, well, I think if you look at, you know, Shine's literature on this, there's a huge body of research that really sort of lays it clearly down how these things work, because you can have a safety culture in an organization, but that safety culture can easily be overridden by higher order priorities that shape culture. And, you know, there's a lot to be said for the sort of safety culture domain, but, you know, actually there is no such thing as a safety culture. There is only culture. And I think a lot of times that disparity between what gets said, what people think, and what they actually do is a result of other priorities, you know, taking a higher order. And also it relates to norms. You know, what is it that's going on around you? People will typically adapt to their surroundings. They'll adapt to what is either explicitly or implicitly communicated as being important by their leaders. What is it that the people around them seem to be doing? And I think that is probably one of the biggest explanations. So.
Yeah, I know my listeners know that I actually have a background in social work. I'm not sure if you're aware of that or not, but I'll just put that on the table now, because I want to drill into what you were saying. There is only culture, and drill in a little bit more on the norms, right? What drives the norms to be developed, and those behaviors that are accepted in the group? Because I agree with you, you know, there's only culture, but there's also within departments group dynamics, and there's not a lot of discussion about how group dynamics can actually shift people's perceptions of normative behavior away from the larger corporate culture. Do you agree or disagree on that?
Well, certainly I agree. I mean, and that is a really interesting topic. You know, when we talk about culture, you know, it's interesting to look at the difference between national culture and organizational culture. I mean, national culture is something that we become part of involuntarily. We're not conscious of it, and it happens from childhood onward. You know, it's part of our becoming a part of society as a whole. And national cultures, are very sort of, they're deeply ingrained beliefs, values, behaviors that aren't easily changed.
Mm-hmm.
Organizational culture is different because organizational culture, is easily affected by leadership, both at the top level and at a lower level. And when leaders change and what they communicate as being important, that can really make a big difference. So I think leadership is probably the key issue there. I also think that organizational culture is interesting because it's learned at an adult age. It's something that we become aware of at a point in time where we can have some active, attitude to what we think about that organizational culture. And I think it's interesting there to note that in large organizations, you'll typically not find one singular culture across the entire company. You'll have a lot of different subcultures from department to department, from unit to unit, and within those you can see typically a fairly wide span of behaviors, thoughts, attitudes, that can largely be dependent on leaders and what they communicate, but it can also be contextual and a result of many other things. If you have scarce resources, if you have a disparity between resources and demands, if you have a lot of uncertainty, if you have other things that can affect people's behavior. So,
Absolutely. And I want to drill down a little bit on leadership here and the fact about what you said about, the organizational culture is learned at an adult age. So you're going to have attitude and perceptions and beliefs and values already ingrained in that demographic that is working in the workplace. And so I want to think about that and how that impacts what's going on. But then I'm going to bring another dynamic in here, Kristian, with you, is the difference between formal leadership and informal leadership. Do you have some thoughts around that and how that plays in the dynamics of people making decisions and the practices that we do at work?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's an important distinction. In some cases, you make the distinction within formal leaders between management and leadership, where management is sort of the administrative task of being a leader, whereas leadership is enacting that behavior of leadership where you're impacting the people who report to you through your behavior, through your style of leadership, all these other things. And that is an incredibly important topic because it really governs the effectiveness of leaders and how well they're able to motivate and support and sort of bring everyone in their team on the same wavelength in working towards a common goal. The second part of it is who is a leader. And that is also really important because you can have people who are not defined as a leader in the organizational chart. They're not defined as a leader formally, but through their role content, they have a very strong leadership role through who they are and through the job they do. And that can typically be senior members of a crew. It can be people who have formal experience as being leaders previously. It can be people who just through their knowledge, through their experience, through their personality, exhibit leadership behaviors that make everyone else listen to them and follow their example in a different way. And that, I think, is an incredibly important topic because these people, they can have an inordinate effect on what people do and on safety culture and on how things get done. But in many cases, they are not, they're not given formal leadership training necessarily. They're not given the follow-up and the resources that a lot of formal leaders have. And we see that in a lot of cases as well, because if you're talking about sort of the lowest level of safety culture, where you have people like, foremen or supervisors or team leaders. They can be the ones who really sort of determine at the sharp end how people behave and what they do. And those guys aren't necessarily defined as leaders in an organization's formal system, which means that they might not be given leadership training in that same way.
Yeah, and I think those people are also very important to identify, build their trust, and collaborate with, because they have such influence in the workforce environment, which is also something that's not often spoken about and leveraged, if you will.
I think any sort of occupational health and safety expert or person will have run into those types frequently, and in any workshop or any department that you get into, you can usually sort of identify the alpha males or females who sort of really have an outsized influence on how things get done.
Yeah.
And you can pick that up also in people, referring to them or looking at them more frequently when you're in a meeting, or they're doing all the talking, and I think that is incredibly important. And I think these social dynamics, these group dynamics that you talk about, they are probably, that's one of the areas where I think safety professionals can really make use of that knowledge at a practical level, in understanding why people do what they do, why people think what they think, both from a proactive point of view, understanding how things get done normally, but also from the perspective of learning from incidents and investigating them and trying to understand why did this happen? Why did people do what they do here? Yeah.
Absolutely. It's very important to drill in and down on that. I recall in one environment that I was working in the grocery retail, is unionized, and I had come in, and because I had some health and safety in my background, and they found out, they put me into health and safety in the store. And all of a sudden, this individual who at first, when I was working there as a part-timer, was very nice to me, changed face and started bullying me. And she was an informal leader, right? So if she doesn't like you, that means a whole hive of people wouldn't like you. And it's interesting because it's about building trust and connecting with people at the end of the day, communication. And I remember when we were sitting in a meeting in a union meeting talking about this. And at first she thought that I wouldn't like her, right? And I had done some research about who she was and found out some stuff that I had real admiration for. And so when I brought that out, her defenses went down, right? And then she shared, I wanted to do health and safety, but then you came in and you took it, right? And I thought, well, haven't we gotten to the bottom of things? Because then when I shared with her, like, well, there's room for many of us to be doing health and safety. Like, wow, what are you interested in? Like, yeah, come help with health and safety. That would be great. She was actually a nurse. She was a cancer survivor. Before that, she was a nurse. And in her bag, she brought all the health stuff that was missing, right, from the safety. And we started to collaborate, and she started bringing health programs into the store. And so, you have an opportunity to look at things two ways. One, the person's being difficult, or why is this going on? What is the underlying? What's your thought about that from that share that I just gave you?
I think it's a great example, and it's an example that points out the importance of emotions in the workplace and affect. And I think that is a topic that very often gets sort of brushed under the rug, and I think can explain a lot of behaviors. And in situations where you can have extremely technical, highly educated people as well, you can have emotional dynamics that have a huge impact on on people's behavior and decision making. You know, is this a person with a lot of standing? Is this a person who is considered likable? Is this a person who people trust? Is this a person who people feel comfortable sharing with? You know, and all these things are not typically part of, you know, formalized training. They're certainly not part of any kind of occupational safety and health, you know, risk assessment, but they're often very important in terms of explaining why people behave the way they do in a group. And I think that really has a big influence. Understanding. Yeah, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Well, I think the other thing that was really important about what you shared is trying to understand why she changed her behavior. You know, why did this person behave the way it did? Because people generally do what they do for a reason, and people generally have good intentions. People generally want to do the right thing. You know, they want to meet a number of different goals, which can be personal, they can be organizational, they can be other things, but people normally do what they think makes sense to them in the situation. And understanding why they do what they do, what makes sense, you know, what shapes their behavior, that really is the best place to start.
No, I like that. Understanding the why, you
Mm-hmm.
know, because
Yeah.
in this case, we found out that it was somebody feeling hurt and not valued.
Right.
Right. And everybody wants to feel valued.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's where occupational health and safety professionals have a really important role in bringing a metaphorical can opener to that group, to that organization, to try to understand what is going on here. You know, why are people behaving the way they do? What are people thinking? What are people prioritizing? What is it that governs people's behavior? What is it that really makes work difficult? What are the things that need attention? And that is you know, in no small part relating to the questions we ask as safety professionals. How do we behave? Are we coming in as sort of the health and safety police? Are we standing there with our clipboards, you know, checking off, is this rule and that rule, is that being followed? Or are we asking people open questions, trying to understand, tell me about your job, tell me about your tasks, tell me about responsibilities, tell me about what is it that makes your job difficult? And I think that is really sort of that shift in role that health and safety needs, because I think we have to be honest and acknowledge that a lot of organizations, the people who are defined as occupational health and safety professionals are not necessarily very popular. They can have a poor reputation, and they can not be well liked. You know, when you show up, you can be met with anything from indifference to active opposition to just sort of resignation. And people are not seeing you as a person coming in to help. People are seeing you as, you know, a hair in the soup, someone who is making your life difficult. And I think shifting the way we approach people, shifting the way we ask questions, shifting the way we try to gain insight into the things that need attention is a way of increasing our standing, increasing our popularity, increasing our perception of being seen as someone who can help us and not just create problems.
You know, I like where you're driving us to. This is such a fabulous conversation. Thank you for coming with me into this discussion, because I know it's not what we planned for, you know, but it's got me thinking again, you know, about when I was working there, we had the corporate health and safety person who, exactly what you're saying, would just come down with a clipboard, really literally basically run through the department, not talking to anybody, just kind of flipping things off on their paper and then out. And then we'd have the food safety Joe come and look at, I know Joe's name. That tells you something, right? It's been like years and years, about God, at least 10 years, and I still know Joe's name. And Joe would come in, and people get excited when Joe came. And, oh, Joe's here. Can he come to our department first? And he was the food safety guy. And Joe always brought something to share, to talk about, to experiment on with the staff. And so we never knew what Joe was going to bring, but we knew Joe was bringing something, right? So have him come to our department first. And he respected the rules of the department. So when he came in, if you had to wear a hairnet, Joe would wear a hairnet, right? And so what recommendations would you have for our audience listening, going, oh my God, Kristian and Tamara, you know what? Maybe it's easy for you guys, but like, share some thoughts and recommendations. Like, what could I be doing to break my habits and change it up so that I'm creating some dynamic engagement? What are your thoughts that you could suggest to our audience around that? Some recommendations.
I think I would start out by just showing people respect and being courteous and acknowledging that people, they might have a very, difficult and complex work situation where there can be many good reasons for them doing things that we instinctively might respond negatively to. And in many cases, we can arrive at a workplace and see things that we immediately dislike. And it can be extremely tempting to dive in and say, stop, you can't do this, and in certain occasions, you need to do that. If that is an immediate threat to their own health and safety, if it's a threat to someone else, you have to do that. But you always have to consider the negative side effects of that, because what you gain in sort of making yourself feel good about you're making this sort of save and sort of laying down the law has to be considered against the backdrop of what does that do to trust and people's attitude towards me and their willingness to share things that might reflect negatively on them afterwards. And I think that's extremely important for the way we enter a conversation with someone. How do we behave? Things that you just mentioned, how do we dress? How do we make sure we follow the local safety protocols? But also, how do we engage in conversation with people? How do we start off? What kind of comments are we sort of sprinkling between our questions? What kind of things are we asking, focusing on? And I think that is probably the biggest thing for me. Sometimes organizations will focus a lot on safety audits or verifications, and that is often about the clipboard and the checklists and making sure that everything is okay. And sometimes that needs to be done, but the downside there, I guess, is this possibility of becoming a traffic cop, where people slow down when they see you. Once you're gone, they go right back to whatever they do otherwise. And that is sort of the key idea, is that it doesn't really matter if we're paper safe if what is actually going on does not correspond to what we're putting down on paper. And having these honest conversations, seeing what is actually going on, having that level of trust where people can share things with you that might reflect negatively on themselves, that is what gives us the ability to fix things. Todd Conklin says that you can't fix a secret, and that is absolutely true. And I think that this is also important in terms of who is out there looking for things, because you can have health and safety professionals showing up every once in a while, but in many cases they're not there every day. So that's why I think in many cases they should probably be taking a step back, maybe trying to support leaders from behind the curtain, but that the people who are out there asking the questions, who actually have the finger on the pulse, seeing what is actually going on, those are the local leaders who are there every day. So I think that is probably the advice that I'd give is, change your attitude, change the way you approach people, change your questioning, and also look at who is out there doing this. Because I think if an organization expects that safety is created by safety professionals, they have a lot of problems, I think. So, yeah.
I like what you're saying, and it goes back to what you were saying. It's learned at an adult age. We are interacting with other adults in the workplace, and when I'm thinking back of the again between that corporate health manager who would zoom through and nobody knew who their name really was, as to Joe who came through. And I remember, like Joe taking time with the line cook to discuss the temperature logs and having the expectation that the line cook would walk him through the logs. It wasn't that Joe went to the logs and overlooked them, like his superior, and checking and then giving notes. No, Joe was like, okay, so and so, can you take me through these books, right? And they'd go through and stuff, and then of course Joe would notice some trends in temperatures and saying, I'm noticing that the temperatures were dipping here, right? Can you let's see, how are you calibrating the thermometer? Like where was this kept? Like he would be asking questions, and then he found out that through discussion with the line cook. And the line cook said to him, he goes, well, come and look at where they put the chickens, and this will help answer it. And they walked and they put the chickens by the front door where the breeze is coming in, right? And so then Joe had an adult conversation with the line cook about the placement of the chickens in front of a door when he's trying to keep them up to temperature, and how frustrating it was for him being so concerned about the temperature of the food. And then Joe used his position to actually move the whole unit down into more of a corridor where it was guarded from the airflow, right? But he wouldn't have had that knowledge if he had come at it from an authoritative perspective.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And it's a great example. And I also think that collectively as an organization, the sum of knowledge and the sum of experience is always a lot greater than what an individual person might have. And I think, combining what this one line cook would tell you with what every other line cook at that same company might tell you, it would probably give you a more complete picture of what needs attention. I think it's always interesting to look at variations in how a job gets done and how individual workers think about a job and how it should get done. In a situation like the one you're describing, for example, you might see a huge difference in the amount of chemicals being used for cleaning. You might see extremely different opinions in how people think about the same rules and procedures, how they should be interpreted. You might see people doing things based on a partial understanding of how the system or the machinery or the equipment works. If it's how do you periodically clean a tunnel washing machine? How is that done? That can be some pretty complex machinery. How is that done?
Yeah.
And people are not necessarily given 100% correct training in how a machine or a piece of equipment works. And I think if you just ask that same question to a lot of different people, you can gain a lot of insight into the variations in how their understanding of it is. And those conversations, they're not necessarily having them without you there. So I think you coming in from the outside, asking some pretty basic questions, that can really sort of facilitate this sharing of knowledge and experience that can sort of smoke out those system level improvements like the one you talked about.
Yeah, no, you've got a lot of great ideas and fabulous recommendations. So thank you for that. We're just curious, and I'm sure my audience is curious also, how did you land in health and safety, Kristian?
I studied human factors in the UK, and then I worked as a researcher for about 9 years. I worked for quite a few years with the Norwegian Navy, where they were going through a big sort of technological transition in high-speed ship navigation. They were moving away from ships that were based on using conventional navigation methods with compasses and paper charts and stopwatches and that into one where they were navigating using computer-based navigation systems. And that really impacted the role of the navigators, their tasks, how they did work. And I found that extremely interesting. I did field work out on the ships. I did simulator studies. This was all great, but I didn't really enjoy the wider atmosphere of working in academia. So I eventually transitioned over into working in industry, and I've been in the oil and gas industry since. And I think being part of an organization is really interesting and valuable, because it means that you get to know a lot of different people who have a lot of different experiences and knowledge that you don't have, and it means that you can sort of understand the dynamics of the company, and that I think is fundamentally important for making an impact as a safety professional.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Now, I do know that we're coming close to the end of our time, but I do want to kind of change gears a little bit, because I do know that you're talking at the EH&S Congress in September. Can you maybe share a little bit with our audience about what you'll be speaking about at the Congress?
Well, as with many other organizations, Equinor has been working with implementing human and organizational performance as part of our sort of overall safety philosophy and safety practice. And I'll be talking about how we've gone about doing that, how we've integrated that with our existing practices, our existing frameworks, what have been the things that we've focused on, and how have we made that work at a practical level within the organization. What things have we started with? How have we rolled it out? How have we found a language that people can relate to? What kinds of communications approach have we taken to bringing this out to leadership? What kinds of small and large changes are we aiming for? Those are the things I'll be focusing on.
Nice. Nice. Well, if everybody wants to listen to more of what Kristian has to share, his knowledge, please check out the EH&S Congress. It's happening September the 13th to 14th in Berlin, and he'll be looking forward to seeing you there. So thank you, Kristian, for joining us today. This has been an amazing conversation.
Thanks, Tamara, for having me. That was great. Yeah.
So thank you, everybody, for joining us again on this Safeopedia podcast. If you've enjoyed listening to our discussion, please hit that like button. If you want to get more notifications about great conversations I'm going to be having with other guests, please hit the subscribe. And are you looking for safety content to share out with your network and your teams? Come and visit us over at safeopedia.com, because we've got a lot of great, credible health and safety content to share with you. Until next time, stay safe.